in the beginning of Hilchas Chanukah, does something he usually does not do. He starts with a history lesson. He starts telling us during the Second Temple, the Greeks try to make decrees against the Jews, Ba'u Daitam, and Chazal tell us not to learn Torah, not to keep Rosh Chodesh, Milah, until finally we were victorious and we won the war, and for 200 years or so we kept Jewish controlled government. So the kasha is, they all ask, was the Rambam giving me the history of Hanukkah? The Rambam himself tells us in the beginning, at the end of the introduction to Mishnah Torah, that Mishnah Torah is a Torah Shabbat Peh Sefer, it's a halachic Sefer. You have the 24 books of Tanakh, and then you have Mishnah Torah. So he's just here to tell me halacha. So why in the world is he giving me the history lesson by Chanuka? So apparently, if he's giving me a history lesson, there must be some halachic significance as well. So we'll take different approaches. What halacha is the Rambam trying to teach us here in the beginning of Hilchas Chanukah? So the first approach is we know that there are many similarities between Chanukah and Purim. They're both post-biblical. And therefore it's interesting to find distinctions between them, because if something is so different, I don't need to find distinctions. I try to find similarity. We try to find some common bonds. But if something is similar, it's interesting to note the differences. So one of the major differences between Purim and Chanukah is the recitation of Hallel. In fact, the Rambam of all places puts Hilchas Hallel, he puts it in Hilchas Chanukah. L'hodos l'Hallel, that's what the laws of Hallel found, not in Hilchas Tefillah, where one might expect to find it, but in Hilchas Chanukah. So the Gemara says, why by Chanukah do we say Hallel, but not by Purim? They're asking, well, why not by Purim don't we say Hallel? So the Gemara gives three answers why we don't say Hallel on Purim. Answer number one, the Gemara says, is because it's a geographical answer. You only say Hallel on a nace that happened in Eretz Yisrael. Chanukah happened in the land of Israel. Purim happened in Persia. I know what you're thinking. Last I checked, the Exodus from Egypt did not happen in Israel. It happened in Egypt, so how can we say Hallel on Pesach? So the Gemara says the old grandfather clause, your father's an accountant, that obviously it means once Yoshua entered Eretz Yisrael, then Eretz Yisrael became a factor. But before that, so of course, you can't expect Eretz Yisrael to be a role on something that didn't happen. So that's the first answer the Gemara gives. The second answer the Gemara gives is Kriyasa Zu Halela. Megillat Esther, there is Hallel, but it's a different type of Hallel. It's the Hallel of Megillat Esther of the Kriyas HaMegillah, that's A2. And A3 is Akate Avdei Achashverosh Adon. It's true they were saved from the decree of Haman, Lahashbid, Lahagra, it's called Yudam Tafin Noshim, but nevertheless, they were still under the domain of Achashverosh. And as the Gemara tells us, they only were allowed to say Hallel on Pesach when they were no longer Avdei Paro, but they became Avdei Hashem. You must be in the state of exclusive Avdei Hashem and no Avdei anyone else in order to say Hallel. So by Purim they were still Akate Avdei Achashverosh, hence they couldn't say Hallel. So there are three reasons the Gemara gives, and with fundamental differences. The first, 1 and 3, is saying it's not a day that warrants Hallel. Number 2 is saying it is a day that warrants Hallel, but we do say Hallel, we do Megillas Esther. So the answer we're focusing on is the third answer. Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. So that's what the Rambam goes into great detail. After the Chashmonaim took over the Malchus, and which is a whole discussion, did they do the appropriate thing, the Chashmonaim? The famous machlokes, the Rambam and the Ramban. The Ramban writes in Parashas Vayechi, well, Yasser Sheva mi Yehuda, that Malchus is exclusively linked to Sheva Yehuda, no one else. And besides the Yerushalmi writes, in addition to that, there's a special lav for a Kohen to take on the Malchus. So therefore, the Ramban writes, even though without the Chashmonaim they were Chasidei Umas Ha'olam, and without them Torah would have been forgotten in Klal Yisrael, nevertheless they were punished greatly because they did this terrible sin of taking over the Malchus. And in fact, the Gemara in Baba Basra, Baba Kama tells us that the whole family of the Chashmonaim were destroyed. And in fact, if someone claims they're a descendant of the Chashmonaim, there's only two options. They're lying, or two, they were slaves in the house of the Beis Chashmonaim. But we have a tradition, and the Ramban says, because of this, because this terrible sin of the Kohanim taking over Malchus Beis David's job, hence they were punished. That's how the Ramban learned. The Rambam, on the other hand, when he describes it in the beginning of Hilchos Chanas, calls it a Yeshua. It's a tremendous thing. The Chashmonaim took over the Malchus, and not only did they take it over, they stayed in control for over 200 years before the Churban. So the Rambam says it was a great thing they did, and the Ramban says it's a terrible thing they did. How can we reconcile? So perhaps we could say it's Lishitason. The Machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramban are consistent with their view elsewhere. There's a famous dispute in the Gemara in Sanhedrin, the second parak, on whether there's a mitzvah chiyuvis of appointing a king. In other words, the Machlokas in the Gemara, Machlokas Amoram, whether there's a chiyuv, because on the beginning of the pasuk it says som tosim, the double language, but at the end of it, it seems to imply it's optional, only if you want to. So one opinion says the first part's the key. You have to, it's a chiyuv. And the second opinion, the other opinion of the Gemara says, no, it's a rishus. So this is a machlokas. In the other room he should be. One, over here. Either the netkin or the waxman.
Okay.
So the machlokas, the Rambam and the Ramban is, the Ramban holds that there's a mitzvah kiyumis. There's no chiyuv to appoint a king. If you want to appoint a king, this is the way it goes. And the Rambam holds it's a chiyuv. One of the three things you have to do when you enter the land of Israel, you have to appoint a king, build the Beis HaMikdash, destroy Amalek. So it could be it's consistent with their views. The Ramban who holds it's a rishus to appoint a king. If you don't have anyone from Malchus Beis David, you don't have any king. No one's telling you have to have a king. So the fact you took it over was a terrible thing. But the Rambam, b'makam she'ein ish yishtadil, b'makam she'ein melech yishtadil yoz melech. If there's no one else, so you have to take someone who's right. The Chashmonaim were right, and therefore it was the Yeshua. So either way, the Rambam writes it was a tremendous Yeshua, and they stayed in Jewish control government for over 200 years. So that's what some of our point. This is why the Rambam focused on the history, because he wants to explain the kasha why by Purim there is no Hallel, but by Chanukah there is. So by Purim, Akate Avdei Achashverosh. So maybe you'll tell me Akate Avdei Greeks. That's what the Rambam is telling me. No, not only did they win the specific battle, but they took over, they ran the country for the next 200 years, and hence the Rambam goes into great deal of Hilchas Hallel to teach me that. So he's not just telling me history, he's telling me history, but not for the sake of history. He's telling me halacha, like he says in Mishnah Torah, that one has the chiyuv to say Hallel throughout Chanukah. But I know what you're thinking. The Rambam, in Hilchas Megillah, it seems to paskin like door number 2, Kriyasa Zu Halela. He seems to go with the opinion that the reason why we don't say Hallel on Purim is because Megillas Esther takes the place. So how do we reconcile it with the Rambam here, which seems to take Akate Avdei Achash? Well, are they mutually exclusive? Perhaps one could say not. But on the other hand, we said from number 2 implies it's a day that warrants Hallel, and from number 3 it's a day that doesn't warrant Hallel. So perhaps we could explain as follows, that there are different types of Hallel. There's the classical Hallel, we know Hallel HaMitzri, the Hallel we say are the Nisim, the flows. When God does tremendous miracles, we say the Hallel. And then there's the Nes Nister, the hidden miracles, that we don't say Hallel on, that God does it behind the scenes. That's the second type of Hallel. That's the Megillus Esther. It's the only book in Tanakh which has no mention of God in it. And God is working behind the scenes. So when it comes to saying Hallel or the classical Hallel, that you need Nisim, the flows. But to say the Hallel of Mekriyas HaMegillah, that's a totally different Hallel. That's a different type. In fact, there's a famous Meiri which says, what happens if you live in a town where there is no Megillus Esther? So the Meiri says, so he passes like number 2, and he says, therefore you should say Hallel. We don't pass like the Meiri. If we don't have Megillus Esther, we don't say anything. We don't do Hallel. Why not? The Meiri makes a lot of sense. It's a very cogent argument. So what do we hold? So the Mefarshim point out that we hold that we can't say, the Chazal only instituted a special Hallel. The only Hallel you could say is a Megillus Esther Hallel, which is God behind the scenes. It's inappropriate to say a Hallel HaMitzri. So it could be that's what it's saying. When it comes to the classical Hallel, then the Rambam has to tell me, Akate Avdei Achashverosh, Akate Avdei Greeks, and therefore we got to tell me about the Chashmonam. But perhaps when it comes to the issue of Kriyas HaMegillah, that's not an issue. Akate, you can't say Hallel even if you are Akate Avdei Achashverosh, and therefore perhaps we could reconcile that it's not a contradiction. It's two different Nakudas there in Hilchas Megillah and Hilchas Chanukah. So either way, that's the first approach, that the reason why the Rambam is telling me this is to teach me the halachas of Hilchas Hallel. One other approach is as follows, that the Rambam begins Hilchas Chanukah by telling us Bebayis Sheni. He tells us exactly when this happened. This all happened during the time of the Second Temple. The Gemara, when it talks about my Chanukah, Alezenes Kavua, it goes through the story of the Paksha. Remember, it doesn't mention anything about Bayesheni. I mean, not that we don't disagree. It was Bayesheni. Maybe some historians do, but we don't agree that it's Bayesheni. But the Gemara doesn't spell it. What forced the Rambam? What was bothering the Rambam that he went out of his way to tell me this happened by? What was he coming to teach? What was he concerned about? And what is by mentioning Bayesheni? How does this help us? So perhaps some suggest as follows, that we know there's a biblical prohibition of Baal Tosef and Baal Tigra, adding to the Torah and subtracting to the Torah. And in fact, it says it in 2 spots. It says it Lashon Rabba Mososifu, and it has the Lashon Yachid Ososif. So it mentions it twice in the Torah in Devarim, Baal Tosef. So as the famous Dubno Magid has a parable, he says, I understand not to take away from the Torah, because obviously if the Torah is perfect, so you'll be missing, but if I'm going to add more to a Torah, what's so bad about adding more? What's the danger about adding on? So he gives a mashal with silverware. That he explains someone moved in next door and he went to his friend to borrow some silverware, some china, some forks and knives, and he said he borrowed one of these, and he came back Saturday night all smiling and said, here. He said, I only gave you one, why are you giving me 2? He said, you never guess what happened, the silverware gave birth. Okay. And this goes on for weeks and weeks. He keeps on asking for more stuff, and he keeps on doubling. The guy's great, there's a great scam going on here. And finally, one time he says, give me everything. He's so excited, yeah, have all my china, all my pots, pans. He comes back with a sad face on, he says, all your pots and pans and silverware died. He said, very funny. Silverware can't die. He says, if they could give birth, it could die. The point being is, the danger of adding is you'll end up subtracting. That was the problem with Chava. She added to it. They added, you can't even touch the tree, and the snake pounced on it. So either way, there's a biblical prohibition about Tosef, about Tigra. In fact, the Rambam writes as a Chiddush, or it seems a Chiddush at first glance. Well, we all know the typical about Tosef is putting 5 species on your lulav and esrog, or putting 5 parshas in your tefillin. That's one Baal Tosef. But the Rambam writes there's another type of Baal Tosef. If based in Hagadol tells you, you know what? Eating chicken and milk together is a biblical prohibition. We all know it's only a rabbinical prohibition. So if based in comes along and makes believe that the Rabbanan law is the right, so that's also about Tosef. And that's how perhaps the Rambam, how does the Rambam know that? From the plural Lashon Rabbim. So Lashon Rabbim is telling me I call Echad v'Echad. I have a prohibition, I can't add 5 species or 5 parshas. But what's the Lashon Yachad on the Beis Din? Beis Din can't come ahead and make a mitzvah d'Rabbanan into a mitzvah d'Oraisa. So that's what the Rambam is saying. The question is, how could we celebrate Chanukah? Maybe, number one, it's a Shaila, how could you make Purim a Yontif? Like Baal Tosef, how can we go ahead and add a new Yontif? So we're going to do that from Purim. But the point being is, so even though we can make Chanukah, but the concern is maybe people think Chanukah is a biblical holiday. That's what the Rambam begins right away. But Bayishain, I'm telling you right away, it's not a biblical holiday. This is a rabbinic holiday happening during the Bayisheni. And therefore, not only that, but the Be'er Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Salan explains, that's what we find by Purim and Chanukah. We find 2 interesting things, many interesting things. But one here is, Purim is the only Yontif where, depending on where you live, you celebrate on a different day. All cities are in time of Yeshua ben Nun. Torah Achasi, it flies in the face of everything we know. Achdus, why are we trying to separate people? So they point out because he wanted to make it clear, how can it be 2 different places? Because it's not on a din daraisa you never find it, but the rabbi set it up to show we're making this mitzvah different. That's how we have by Ner Chanukah. The only mitzvah we have, Ner Ishubeso, Mahadrin, and Chazal, when they set up the mitzvah, they wanted to make it recognizable that you know it's different in order to avoid the prohibition of Baal Tosef. So the 2 approaches are, why does the Rambam go into a history lesson in Hilchos Chanukah, where he doesn't go anywhere else? And the first approach was, he had to tell me about the Chashmonim continuing their control for the next 200 years, hence the Narakate of the Greeks, and therefore they could say Hallel. Or the second approach is, but by Yesheni, that he goes out of his way to make it recognizable, because it says by Purim, everyone knows that Dvarim Yiduim, everyone knows it's not biblical, it's in Megillah Esther. But no one, how do you know about Chanukah? So by Yesheni, and therefore you have to go into it to elaborate, and they did the mitzvah differently to make it clear we're not in violation about Tosef, we are making this clear Chanukah is only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan and not a mitzvah min Torah. So the Rambam begins Hilchos Chanukah. Number 1, it's Perek Shlishi. What happened to Aleph and Beis, as we'll see, he combines Hilchos Purim Megillah together with Chanukah. So that's one question, like why couldn't he just, to the 4 chapters, why couldn't he just call it Hilchos Purim 2 chapters, Hilchos Chanukah 2 chapters, number 1. And secondly, why is Hilchos Chanukah last? We know we're celebrating Chanukah tomorrow night. That happens first on the calendar. Purim is later. So why does he put Purim before Chanukah? So we'll come back to that later, something from a Selevan. We'll just start off we'll read the Rambam. He does something he doesn't do anywhere else. He gives us a little history lesson. The Rambam in Mishnah Torah, he tells us he's a halachic sefer. In fact, the Rambam at the end of his introduction to Mishnah Torah, he writes, you only need, I guess whether we call it 2 books or 25 books, but he says, you only need the 24 books of Tanakh, and then you have me. That's why I call it the Mishnah Torah. You know, the Mishnah Torah is Devarim, is the Sefer Devarim. It's known as the summary of the whole Torah. So some people they thought a little too much gaiva for the Rambam, that he called his Sefer Mishnah Torah. So in the yeshivas they don't call it Mishnah Torah, they call it the Yad Chazaka, so therefore they call it by another name. But not that the Rambam needs my defense, but how can we justify the Rambam having a little gaiva or a little self-confidence? So it's a famous Vilna Gaon. The Gemara says that a Talmud Chacham, a Torah scholar, which everyone agrees the Rambam would fit into, is allowed to have an eighth of an eighth, 1/64th of gaiva, or a little, overconfidence. Where does the Gemara doesn't really give a source? Where does the Gemara know this from? So the Gra says, it's a pasuk in the Chumash, kind of. He says, if you look in the 8th chapter, the 8th parsha in Sefer Bereshis, and you look at the 8th pasuk in Sefer Bereshis, that's Parshas Vayishlach, and the pasuk says, Yaakov's talking to God, Katonti mikol hachasidim. God, I don't deserve all of this. I don't deserve all of this, but I deserve some of it. So we see from here that a person's allowed to have a little bit of gaiva. So therefore, perhaps that's what the Rambam had in mind. But either way, that's what he writes in his Mishnah Torah. You only need the 24 books of Tanakh, and his book. Clearly, it's not the accepted minhag. It would have saved me thousands and thousands of dollars if my only sefer was the Rambam. Even that being said, the most svarim probably written on the Rambam are many. So either way, the Rambam writes, I'm only here to tell halacha. I am your Torah Shabbat Peh. So why over here does he start giving us the history? I'll just read the history for a minute. But by no other place in Mishnah Torah do we find a history lesson. He writes, B'vayisheni, during the time of the Second Temple, Malchus Javan goes to Xeris HaYisrael, they basically made religious decrees, Be'ludaitam, they didn't let us learn Torah mitzvahs, and they took our money and our daughters, and they entered the temple, and they would matame the oil, and they fought with us, until finally God and the Chashmonan came along. The Chashmonan with the Kohanim Gedolim, they came along, and they beat out the Syrian Greeks. The Ramido Melech with the Kohanim and the Chashmonan remained kings. V'chazdo Malchus Yisrael Yeser Amatayim Shana. And he says, for over 200 years, Jewish-run government continued Ad HaChurban Hasheni. And he goes on, when the Jews were victorious, they found the oil. So the question is, why does the Rambam begin Hilchos Chanukah with history lesson if we know nowhere else? So perhaps a simple answer could be is because, as he writes in his introduction, how does he begin Hilchos Megillah? He doesn't go into stories, but he says, Hadvarim Yiduim. It's well known. Why is it well known? Because it's the Megillah Esther. If the only book you have is Tanakh and the Rambam, you're not going to know anything about Chanukah, because Chanukah is only a couple of pages in Gemara Shabbos. So the Rambam had to give you the history because he had to tell you before he goes into all the halachas of Chanukah, he has to tell you what Chanukah is, because there's no documentation in Tanakh. In fact, they say Derek Drush. This isn't Derek Drush, this is the regular pshat. Chanuka Pei. They rested on the 25th day of Kislev, but they say Chanuka Pei. They wanted to make Chanukah the 25th book, and they rested it in Chanukah, didn't make the cut, and therefore never made it. So therefore the Rambam had to go through a little history lesson to what it's about. But still it's difficult. The Rambam is not telling us history, so we have to find some halachic significance in the Rambam. Or else, so the different schools of thought about why the Rambam, what halacha is he coming to tell me through the history. So the first approach will be as follows. We know there are many similarities between Chanukah and Purim, and they're both post-biblical. And of course, when you have holidays which are very similar, it's always interesting to find differences. If it's so different, you try to find a common denominator. But Chanukah and Purim, you try to find out so little details here or there. So one of the famous differences, the Gemara asked in Megillah and Erechin, how come there is no Hallel on Purim? We know there is Hallel on Chanukah. In fact, the Rambam, of all places, you expect the Rambam to discuss Hilchos Hallel in Hilchos Tefillah, he discusses it in Hilchos Chanuka. So Chanuka is the day where we say Hallel all 8 days of Chanuka. So the Gemara asks, if Chanuka and Purim are similar, how come when it comes to Chanuka, Hallel every day, and Purim we can't even get 1 day of Hallel in? How come? So the famous Gemara gives 3 different answers. 3 answers why no Hallel on Purim. Answer number 1 is a geographical answer. The Gemara says you only say Hallel on miracles that happen in the land of Israel. And since Chanukah happened in Eretz Yisrael, the Beis HaMikdash, and Purim happened in Persia, hence it's not a day that warrants a Hallel. I know what you're thinking. Last I checked, the Exodus from Egypt did not happen in Israel either. It happened in Egypt, and we say Hallel on Pesach. So the Gemara says the old grandfather clause. The Gemara says obviously it's only once Yoshua entered Eretz Yisrael, and we had Eretz Yisrael. But before we had Eretz Yisrael, obviously Eretz Yisrael wasn't an impediment. So therefore, that's the first answer. We only say Hallel on miracles that happened in Eretz Yisrael. So Purim is out. A2, the Gemara says we do say Hallel on Purim. Who says we don't say Hallel on Purim? It just doesn't look like our classical Hallel. This Hallel is called Kriyasa Zu Halela. It's called Megillas Esther. When we read the Megillah, that's Persumei Nisa, that's praising God, and therefore that is the Hallel. So A2 is there is Hallel, except it's a different Hallel. It's Megillas Esther. And A3 is Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. That even though we went free from the decree of Haman, Lahashme Lahagur is called Yudim Tafin Nashim, nevertheless we're still under the domain of Achashverosh. And in fact, as the Gemara tells us, how were we permitted to say Hallel Leal Pesach? It wasn't until we were no longer Avdei Paro, but we became Avdei Hashem. You have to be in the status of only Avdei Hashem. Exclusively Avdei Hashem, then you could say Hallel. But if we're Avdei Paro, Avdei Achashverosh, we can't say Hallel. So therefore, that's why the Gemara says we don't say Hallel on Purim, because even though we were free from the decree, but we were still under the domain of Achashverosh. Amen. So that's the Gemara's answer. So comes along the Mefarshim and says this is why the Rambam brought down this halacha here, because why is the Rambam go into detail? The Chashmonaim took over and they remain Jewish-controlled government for over 200 years? Because you're probably wondering, Akate Avdei Greeks, Hainu. Even though we weren't killed with the Hellenists and that, but we're still under the domain of someone else. The Rambam is teaching us in Halacha Aleph, it was Jewish-controlled government in Eretz Yisrael. We were only Akate Avdei Hashem. We were no longer Akate Avdei. We weren't under any foreign yoke, any foreign government. And therefore, that's what the Rambam's coming to teach me here. The reason why you're allowed to say Hallel on Chanuka is because of this. Because we took back Eretz Yisrael, the Beis HaMikdash, and we ran our own government. So that's how some explain. The only question on this is if you look at the Rambam in Hilchos Purim, in Megillah, when he talks about the 3 reasons, he seems to pass like number 2. Kriyasa Zu Halela. He seems to paskin the reason why we don't say Hallel on Purim is because we read the Megillah. So the question is, so how do we reconcile? The Rambam in Hilchos Purim seems to go with answer number 2, Kriyasa Zu Halela. But in Hilchos Chanuka, based on the Shtickle Torah, he seems to be working with Akate Avdei. We're no longer Akate Avdei Achashverosh on it. And in fact, they point out that there's a famous Meiri. What happens if you live in a town on Purim where there is no Megillah? So what do? Do you say Hallel? Because the Gemara says Kriyasa Zu Halela. The Meiri paskins like that opinion. So what happens if there is no Megillah Esther in the town, or you don't have a Baal Koreh, whatever it is, you can't read you can't have access to a Megillah. So Meiri says, Ein Achinami, we recite Hallel on Purim. So he paskins like 2, and he takes it to the logical extreme. If there's no Megillah, according to A1 and A3, you would never say Hallel because it's not days that were in Hallel, either because it's not in Israel or under the domain of Achashverosh. But A2 says fundamentally we should say Hallel, and we do. It's Megillas Esther, but if there is no Megillas Esther, we do say Hallel. we don't paskin like the Meiri. If you're stuck in a place where there is no Megillas Esther, we do not say Hallel. The question is, why not? The Meiri seems very compelling. It seems like a strong argument that we should say Hallel. So the Mepharshim explain as follows: that there's two different types of Hallel. There's what we know as Hallel HaMitzri, like the Hallel we say over Nisim, the flows, supernatural miracles, Kriyas Yamsuf, Yitzias Mitzrayim. And there's a second type of Hallel, more on the Nisim, the stars, on the hidden miracles, i.e. nature, on the everyday things. Purim is the only book, Megillas Esther is the only book in Tanakh which doesn't have God's name in it, because the whole miracle was, if you look at the Sefer, it's one coincidence after another, and only you have to see God behind the scenes. In fact, there's a famous story with one of the Hasidic Rabbi, and they were running, I guess, from the Holocaust. They ended up in Russia, and so one of the Rebbeim, the Hasid, told his Hasidim, go get me the Russian newspaper. So the Talmud, the Chassid, brought up some guts and said, but Rabbi, you don't read Russian. Like, why are you wasting my time? He said, no. The key is you have to learn to read in between the lines. It's not what it says in the newspaper, but you have to learn to see God behind the scenes. So either way, so by Megillas Esther, God's name isn't mentioned. You have to. It's God through Derech HaTeva. In fact, there's a famous Meshach Chochmah. He says, the Gemara tells us, one who says Hallel every day, one who says Hallel every day is a Magadef and a Macharef. It's terrible. And the Gemara and the Rishonim explain, it's not just every day, it's any day that any day that you shouldn't be saying Hallel. You say it, you're cursing out God. And yet the Gemara says, that's the Gemara in Shabbos, the Gemara in Brachas tells us, one who says Ashrei every day will be Zoche to Olam Haba, Muftach LaOlam Haba. So last I checked, Ashrei comes in the book of Tehillim, and Hallel comes in the book of Tehillim. So how come, if I say Ashrei, I'm the greatest, and if I say Hallel, I'm terrible? So the Meshach Chochmah answers, because when do you say Hallel? You're as good as your last miracle, God. You're as good as your last at-bat. In other words, that when you do a miracle, then I'll believe it. But if a person only sees God on Nisim, the flows, when I break the laws of nature, you're missing the whole essence. But Ashrei is in the form of Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, Hey. One who sees God on the everyday things, your hashkaf is to see God on the everyday things, that will be Muftach Olam Haba. So that's what the Meshach Chochmah says. So that's the yesod here. You have two types of Hallel. We have the classical Hallel we say on breaking the laws of nature. That's the Hallel as we know it. But then there's another type of Hallel. It's called Kriyas HaMegillah. That's on Nisim. That's on the hidden miracles. So therefore, the Meiri seems very compelling. If there's no Hallel, so let's say it. The answer is no. We assume Chazal instituted a separate Hallel. The classical Hallel is not appropriate on Purim. Purim, you're thanking God on Teva, on doing the miracles behind the scenes, and therefore, even if we do have a Hallel, even if we don't have a Megillah, we still don't say Hallel, because that's on a Hallel on Nisim the flows. And perhaps for that Hallel, Kriyas Zu Halela, that you're not worried about Akate Avdei Achashverosh, because that's a hidden one, and that's not an issue. So perhaps you could work with the Rambam and Hilchos Purim could say one way, and the Rambam and Hilchos Chanuka could do another way. But either way, that's approach number one. Is the reason why the Rambam gives us a history lesson is because he wanted to tell us how important it is Jewish controlled government, and the fact that we're no longer Akate Avdei Greeks. That's why we can say how. In fact, there's another thing we see from this Rambam. There's a famous machlokes, the Ramban versus the Ramban, on did the Chashmonaim did the right thing. That we know the Chashmonaim are Kohanim, and they took over the Malchus, they took over the kingship. And we know, we're going to read in a couple of weeks in Parashas Vayechi, well, Yasser Shevet mi Yehuda, that we know the kingship comes from Yehuda. And in addition to that, the Yerushalmi writes, there's an Isser for Kohen to become a melech. Separation of church and state. We don't want the spiritual leaders involved in this political position. So how could it be that Chashmonaim took over? So there's a famous Ramban in Parashas Vayechi which says even though the Chashmonaim were Chasidei Olam, in fact, without them Torah would have been forgotten. We wouldn't even have the Torah today. Nevertheless, because of the terrible avera they did by taking over the kingship. The whole dynasty was destroyed. In fact, the Gemara goes so far as to say, if anyone claims they're from the family of the Hashmonaim, either they're lying or they were avadim in there, but they don't exist because of the terrible sin. So the Ramban clearly says it was a terrible mistake the Hashmonaim made, and that's why they were punished. But the Rambam clearly does not learn that way. The Rambam talks about Vahoshiyam miyadam yitzilam Vahoshiyah. He calls it a geula. It's a Yeshua. It's a tremendous thing that the Hashmonaim took over and they kept Jewish controlled government for 200 years. So it seems to be a fundamental machlokes, the Rambam and the Ramban, on whether they did a good thing. What's the nakudas hamachlokes between them? What does the Rambam say they're the greatest and the Ramban says they're terrible? So perhaps it could be totally on another machlokes, Rambam. And a more fundamental question is on the obligation of appointing a king. The Gemara in the second parak of Sanhedrin, there's two opinions in the Gemara which will be a machlokes, Ramban, who we passed him like. Whether is there an obligation to appoint a king? Is it a mitzvah chiyuvis, a mandatory mitzvah, or it's only an optional mitzvah? In other words, the pasuk says "Som tasim olav melech." You can't get more direct. A double command: "You shall surely appoint a king." But at the end of the pasuk, it seems to imply only if the people want it, only if you want to appoint one. So it's a machloket in the Gemara whether there's a mitzvah chiyuvis or a mitzvah rishus. So the Rambam paskins it's a mitzvah chiyuvis. In fact, the Rambam writes, one of the three commandments we're going to have when we take over the land of Israel is to appoint a king, destroy Amalek, and build the Beis HaMikdash. So the Rambam clearly learns it's a mitzvah chiyuvis, and the Ramban learns it's a mitzvah sarishus. So perhaps it's l'shitason. The Rambam will hold you have a chiyuv to appoint a king. So therefore, obviously, well, Yosef Sheva mi Yehuda. But let's say there's no one fit from Yehuda, and I have to have a king. So b'makam she'ein ish yishtadel b'makam she'ein melech mi malchus beis Yehuda. Find someone who knows how to run a country. So that was a Chashmonaim. So therefore, it wasn't ideal. But under that situation, they did a tremendous thing. If there was someone around from Yehuda, they would have had them. There was no one else around, and they had to take the bull by the horns, and they did a tremendous thing. And the Ramban writes it's a mitzvah rishus. So if you don't have anyone capable from Yehuda, don't do it. If you don't have to have a king, don't. So perhaps that issue is dependent on a more fundamental question of whether one has a chiyuvis to appoint a king or not. But either way, that's how somewhere in Pshat in the Rambam he's focusing on the Jewish-run government. So we could say halal because we're no longer akate avdei we're not akate avdei Greeks anymore. We became free. That's one approach. Another approach is as follows. There's a famous lavush that also we want to focus on another difference between Purim and Chanukah. And there's a famous lavush which says, how come when it comes to Purim we have a Chiyuv Suda? We all know the Purim Suda. And yet by Chanukah, even though we all have plenty of Chanukah parties, but strictly speaking, there is no Chiyuv Suda on Chanukah. So he wants to know how come? Why on Purim there's a Chiyuv Suda, but on Chanukah there is no Chiyuv Suda? So the famous answer of the lavush is, and there are other answers, but one is based on the Shiltis, that Purim had to do with Kabbalas HaTorah, and any time you have an accomplishment by Torah, like that's why we make a siyam and we make a party when we have a siyam. So therefore Purim was kimu v'kibbul, they accepted the Torah. But the one we're focusing on is the lavush. He says because the nature of the persecution was totally different. When it came to Purim, the persecution was physical. Haman, he didn't care if you believed in God or not. He didn't care if you could have been Machal Shabbos. You're a Jew, I want you dead. Kind of like Hitler. It was a genetic thing. And in fact, even if you weren't halachically Jewish, he didn't care. He still put you to death. So by Haman, by Purim, it was a much more physical thing. But Chanukah, they didn't want us dead. They wanted us to join. They wanted us to take on the Greek culture and take on their religion. They didn't want us dead. It's only when we refused to do that, so then they attacked us. So Chanukah, that's why we celebrate B'Halal B'Hodah. We say Halal, we light near Chanukah, near Mitzvah Torah Or represents the fight against the Greek culture. So therefore, that's why the Wolvish writes, that's why there is no meal on Chanukah. And in fact, this is the famous Beis Halevi we had in Parashas Vayishlach, where he says, the Torah says, Yaakov's praying to God, Hatzileni na miyad achi miyad Esav. Save me from the hands of my brother, save me from the hands of Esav. We all know Esav was his brother, so why does the Torah write both? Just tell me the hands of my brother or hands of Esav. So the famous Beis Halevi that says these are the two types of anti-Semitism we're going to have. They're going to come as an Esav with the sword, the pogroms, we want you dead, that's it. And then also going to come as Achi, Jews for Jesus, to intermarriage, get you to convert with them, whatever they're going to do. And therefore, and perhaps the Achi is more dangerous. As we see today, the intermarriage rate is some 50%. And even though we don't want pogroms either, but the assimilation rate and coming in Miyad Achi is just as bad, especially from a spiritual level. And that's why Chazal gave us 2 Yomim Tovim to remember this. The Yomim Tovim of Purim and Chanukah. Purim represents how to fight against physical, the Hitlers, the Hamans of the world. And Chanukah is the time of Jewish education, fighting against assimilation and all that. And that's why there is no Suda on Purim. However, it comes along the Rambam. We don't paskin like the Rambam. The Rambam paskin, there is a Chi of Suda on Chanukah. And that's why, so that's how they say the Rambam, why is the Rambam, when in his history lesson, he puts focus, Lachat, he focuses on the Milchama, that they also had a big war, they had a big military victory of the Chashmonaim. So the Rambam is alluding to, don't ignore the military victory as well. That was a major part of Chanukah, and it also was a physical thing, and therefore also the Rambam Paskins, one has a Chi of Suda on Purim and one. That's why the Rambam goes into the war as well, and telling us the history of Chanukah, to tell me that Chanukah is the same as Purim. Chanukah as well, we don't paskin like this Rambam, but the Rambam paskins that there is a Chi of Suda, because also the military victory was the major part of the miracle of Chanukah, and the Jews taking over control of the government. So that's the second approach to tell me that there's a Chi, to explain the halachic angle why there's an obligation to have a Suda on Chanukah. A third approach is as follows. The Rambam tells us, B'Bayis Sheni, this happened during the Second Temple. If you look at the Gemara, when the Gemara talks about it, there's a whole discussion anyway, Gemara historians, when all these things happened anyway, but we won't go into that. But the Rambam writes, B'Bayis Sheni, this is when it happened. And the Gemara doesn't give us a time when it happened. It doesn't say it happened in the B'Bayis Sheni. What's bothering the Rambam? The Rambam seems to go out of his way to tell me, you know what? This happened during the time of the second. Why is? I mean, it's nice, but why is he telling me in the Mishnah Torah? What halacha is he trying to? Is he concerned about? He's trying to teach me here. So the Mefarshim explain as follows. What's this concept here, B'Bayis Sheni, and what's he going? So that we know there's a biblical prohibition of Baal Tosif and Baal Tigra. We know there's the 613 commandments. You can't add the 614th. And you can't make 612. Each one are biblical prohibitions, and in fact we know. So there's a famous Dubno Amagid gives a parable, and he says, I understand why there's an issue about Tigra, about taking away. The Torah is perfect, 613. If you take away, you'll be missing out. But why can't I add? So he gives a famous parable, the Dubno Amagid. I heard about 40 years ago, probably 30 years ago. No, so he comes. The story he gives is someone just moves into the neighborhood, your next door neighbor. He comes by Erev Shabbos or some Simcha. He says, you know what? I need to borrow a plate, some silverware, and agapa. I need another setting. And he says, great, okay. He gives him the setting, and then Motzai Shabbos, the guy comes back with a big smile on his face, and he comes back with 2 plates, 2 of everything. He says, what are you doing? I only gave you 1 plate. He said, you'll never believe what happened. The silverware, the plates gave birth, and now there's 2. Okay, great. If the guy's giving me back 2, I'll take it. This goes on. Next week he borrows 2. He comes back with 4. Until finally, about a couple months in, he said, I need everything. Give me all your silver, all your best china. Saturday night he comes back with a very sad face and he's in tears. He says, where's all my stuff? He said, you'll never believe what happened. It was a terrible tragedy. All your silverware in China passed away. I said, what are you talking about? Silverware doesn't die. He says, if it gives birth, it could die also. So the point being is, so adding is okay, but the problem is, usually when you add, it ends up being subtracting, because you don't know what you added, and once you start that's the whole story with Adam and Chava and Gan Eden. When you start adding, well, you can't even touch the tree, it always ends up worse. So either way, there's a biblical prohibition about Tosef, about Tigra. In fact, it's written twice in the Torah, in Lashon Rabim and Lashon Yachid, Lo Sosifu and Lo Tosef. And in fact, the Rambam says there are 2 different types of Baal Tosef. We all know the classical Baal Tosef is, on Sukkot we put 5 species in the Daled Minim. In our Tefillin we put 5 parshos in the Tefillin. That's classical, that's typical Baal Tosef. But the Rambam gives another Baal Tosef. He says, you know what? If the Beis Din Hagadol comes along and says, you know what? Having milk and chicken together is a biblical prohibition. We all know that only cooking meat and milk is biblical. Chicken and milk is only rabbinical. In fact, Rabbi Yossi Agli, in his town, he felt it was even mutter. That's the Gemara in Shabbos. We don't paskin like him. But it's only a machlokas if it's mutter or not. No one says it's an issa d'oraisa to have chicken and milk together. So if the Beis Din Hagadol says, you know what? Cooking chicken and milk together is a biblical prohibition, they violate Baal Tosef. Where did the Rambam get this from, they all ask? So perhaps from these 2 psukim. When the Torah writes Lashon Rabim, that's L'chol Echad V'Echad, that applies to every individual. When it writes it in Lashon Yachid, it's addressing the Beis Din Hagadol, the single unit, and therefore that's the prohibition of where the Rambam gets it from. So the Rambam's clear, even making something which is D'Rabbanan, making it look like you're doing a mitzvah min Torah, that's a problem about Tosef. In fact, to the Gemara in Megillah even asks, how could we have a holiday of Purim? What about Baal Tosef? How could you add a new holiday? We have biblical holidays. How do we have a right to add Chanuka, Purim? In fact, Esther and Mordechai, they had to address. There was a big question during the Gemara. So Mordechai and Esther, and they came out. The answer is yes, as we know, we can celebrate Purim, but it wasn't so simple in the Gemara. But the conclusion was yes, and therefore you can. So Chazal went out of their way that if you're being misaken a new yontif, it has to be clear that everyone knows it's not a biblical yontif, or else that's Baal Tosef. So therefore, they try to do something unique by each yontif. That's what the Be'er Yosef points out of Yosef Selevan. He says, what do we find unique about the celebration of Purim? There's a lot of things about Purim, but what I'm focusing on is it's the only yontif where, depending where you live, you celebrate on a different day. I don't mean Yontif Sheini Shagoyis, that's just a Sveik of the Din, a Minhag. But on Purim, if you live in a walled city from Yemos Yoshua Ben Nun, you celebrate Purim on the 15th. Everywhere else you celebrate on the 14th. Why did Chazal, when they set up the mitzvah, it's opposite. Torah achasi. We're looking for unity. We're not looking for ways to split up people. That happens by itself. We're trying to unify, not separate. So why would they set it up? So there are many answers, but the Yosef Selevan points out, the Chazal wanted to go out of the way to make it clear it's not a biblical mitzvah. No, how could it be that someone you can't have Pesach one day here, Pesach one day here. Everyone knows Sukkot is the same day. But the fact that it's 2 different days, that was one of the many things they did to make it clear. And that's what the Rambam writes in the beginning of Hilchos Purim. It's a Dvarim Yiduim, it's a Takanas Nevi'im. It's clear, everyone knows it's only a post-biblical holiday. And what do we find by Chanuka? What did it do by Chanuka? So that's what the Gemara on Chaf Aleph on Bebeis, the Gemara does. We have something totally different on Chanuka. We don't have any other mitzvah. We have 3 different levels. We have, on the basic level, you light 1 candle per night, you get the mitzvah. That's the regular mitzvah. Then you have Mahadrin. If you have 10 members in your house, you light 10 candles. And Bahajim and Mahajin, either Machlokas, Tosas, Rambam, Sephardi, Ashkenaz, whether you light one menorah, 8 candles on the last night, or you light 80 candles, 10 times 8, 10 people times 8. So either way, but why? We usually find Mahajin on cheese or on salami. Why do we never find it by mitzvahs? So Chazal went out of the way to make sure that the uniqueness of celebrating Chanukah, again, to make sure everyone knows this is not a biblical holiday. We are not in violation about Tosim. And that's why the Rambam said, he starts off Hilchas Chanukah, B'bayis Sheni. Don't think as some biblical mitzvah. This happened during the Second Temple. This is a rabbinical mitzvah of Chanukah. Don't think for a second we are celebrating any biblical holidays. This is not Baal Tosef. And with this we can understand a famous piece from Rav Soloveitchik that I asked at the beginning. We know the Rambam, he puts Hilchas Purim and Hilchas Chanukah together. He puts it, the first 2 chapters are Hilchas Megillah and Purim. The next 2 chapters are Hilchas Chanukah. So number one is, why does he put Purim before Chanukah? And secondly, also, why does he put them together? Why not just have a separate heading, Hilchas Purim, 2 chapters, Hilchas Chanukah? What's bothering the Rambam that he has to put Purim first and he has to put them together? So Rav Soloveitchik has a famous piece. He points out as follows, he says, because what was the Rambam bothered by? What we were just talking about, the issue about Tosef. How could we celebrate the holiday of Purim, which I said was a major discussion during that time? How could they celebrate Purim? So the Gemara discussed it and they concluded that it's okay. So that's what he points out. You know why you have to put Purim before Chanukah? Because from a theological point of view, without Purim, there never would have been a Chanukah. If Chazal would have nixed the celebration of Purim saying there ain't no new holidays, you wouldn't be able to celebrate Chanukah either. So he's telling me chronological order. In other words, like we have a bracha by the Birkas Erisin, we say Ayidei Chuppah v'Kedushin. So really it's out of order. First you do Kedushin, then you do the Chuppah. So the many answers by Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, others point out that it's talking about historically speaking. Originally, how did you meet someone? You met a woman in the shuk and that was it. You just had the chuppah. And later on at Har Sinai, you had the Kedushin. So therefore, in the Nusach HaBracha is telling us the history. That's what the Rambam's telling us here. He dafka put Chanukah together with Chanukah because Chanukah only makes sense in the context of Purim. If Chazal would have nixed Purim, there never would have been a Chanukah. And that's why as well, he put it in the same Hilchas Chanukah and Purim, and that's why he put Purim first and then Chanukah in order to teach us this lesson about that it's not a problem about Tosef. And one last answer I'll give you. Why does the Rambam go into the history again? A fourth shot is they point out as follows. The Rambam writes, the mitzvah of Chanukah, it's Galos Esanes. When you look at the Ner Chanukah, we all know there's a mitzvah of Persumei Nisa, publicizing the miracle. And in fact, Rav Yaakov Emden goes so far. Normally, we paskin brachas eina ma'akvas. Like if I put on tefillin in the morning and I didn't make a bracha, I should. But if I didn't make a bracha, there's no problem. I get my mitzvah of tefillin, I get my mitzvah of tzitzis. Any mitzvah, usually the bracha is not an obstacle in performing it. It's a nice thing to do. But the Rav Yaakov Emden has a chiddush. He says when it comes to Ner Chanukah, if you don't make the bracha, you're not yotzei the mitzvah. Why? Because he says the whole purpose of Ner Chanukah is Persumei Nisa. So he explains that if you just a person that sees a candle on the table or a light, it's not recognized. We don't pass him like him, but he goes even so far as to say it's not recognizable enough. By making the bracha, you are stating this is the Ner Chanukah, and that's why, in fact, that's where we have a interesting minhag. It's not brought down in the Gemara. It was a later institution about lighting in the Beis HaKnesses, lighting in the shul. There's no mention in the Gemara. Interesting, when there's a Tshuvas Rivash. When did it start? When did it come about? So the Rivash says, the Gemara tells us originally they used to light candles outside Pesach Beso, and B'Shas HaSakana they moved it inside. So the Rivash claims once they moved it from outside to inside, they wanted it, the Persumei Nisa was down. They wanted to somehow buffer the laws and try to improve on the Persumei Nisa. Hopefully the more people in shul than in your house. So they instituted Madlikin U'Mevarchim, and we even make a bracha. Even the Mechaber, who usually says you don't make a bracha on a minig, even the Mechaber says to make a bracha on the halakas Eretz Chana, because you light candles in shul, no one's going to know what is it. By Dafka making a haluk near shul Chanukah, that is the mitzvah of Persumei Nisa. In fact, that's the famous Vilna Gaon. He explains every time Chazal give us a personal mitzvah of Persumei Nisa in our home, we have to publicize it. Where does he say it by? We know in the Haggadah, we say Hallel in the Haggadah. There's a minhag, really it's a minhag Sfarad, many Ashkenazis do it because the Soloveitchiks were pro, saying Hallel, Leil Pesach in Shul with the bracha. Again, straight minhag Ashkenaz is no minhag Sfarad. It says the Briskers say you have to say it. So, what's the reason for this Hallel in Shul? So the Vilna Gaon writes, because since there's a mitzvah for Persumei Nisa in your home of saying Hallel, so Chazal set it up to also make a public one. So that's what the Gra says here. The reason why, well, based on the Gra, that's what the Brisker Rav says here. That's why we light candles in shul. Anytime there's a mitzvah for Persumei Nisa privately, they wanted to make it. So the Soloveitchiks are very strict. Dafka in the shul. Only in the Beis HaKnesset is that there. Rav Shlomo Zalman and also others, Chabad and others are more lenient. They say, well, it's Persumei Nisa. Well, there's only about 20 people in shul. There are hundreds of people walking in City Hall or wherever, or some chasana. So the Lubavitcher Rabbi obviously felt that you should light at weddings and other places. That's a major discussion among the postim, whether you could light outside of the shul. We lighting without a bracha, there's no harm. But even making a bracha, the Soloveitchiks felt it was a bracha l'vatola. In fact, they went so far, it's not just in the shul, they said dafka between mincha and ma'ariv. And I mean, if you're having a 2 o'clock mincha and a 10 o'clock ma'ariv, you can't make a bracha either. With the Rav Soloveitchik from his father and others say, because in order to light candles in shul, you say you need a shem sibor. You need to have a concept of a tzibor. He said the Rav's example was, I guess there's this Yiddish paper called the Allgemeine Journal. He says 10 men reading the Alg, that doesn't make it tzibor. 10 people reading the Jewish press or the Canadian, that doesn't make it tzibor. He says you have to be mishtate for a mitzvah. He says so when you daven mincha, you get the shem sibor, but you're still going to be davening ma'ariv together. So you dafka between mincha and ma'ariv, when you still have the shem sibor. Therefore you dafka, and that's why he says by ma'ariv, one should make sure. He says you should do it before the tiskabel, the last kaddish, because once you do that last kaddish at the end of the sibor, so even though you're not going to have, it's not a mincha ma'ariv, but he says you have to do it before. That's why many say you would not, for most people who just daven mincha, many times you go to shul, mincha erev this Friday, you go to shul and there's no one there, meaning there's not a minyan. And our minhag is you need 10, it's a discussion, I'll go with 10 men, it's a discussion, because you count women for this, because it's Persumei Nisa. But let's assume you don't have 10 people in the shul. So most people, the minhag probably is people light candles anyway with the bracha. Rav Soloveitchik would be against even then. You can't, if you don't have 10 men in the, and he also said that you have to have an earlier mincha and then do it. So he's very strict on dafka b'beis HaKnesset. Others yesh v'yesh.
So you're required to have dafka mincha in. You don't normally have mincha.
No, he's not. I don't know if he goes daf. He's just saying that don't light candles. He's saying that was. I don't think he says you dafka have to have a mincha. It's a nice thing to do. I think he's saying Chazal only introduced it. If you're not going to have it, don't do it. He's talking about people who do it when it's not that. I don't think he says he'll be Moses. It's a nice hider if you want to do it, but you're not mechuyev to do it. He's just saying don't make a bracha if you don't do it, but he doesn't go that far to say that you have to do it. So that's what. So we see the focus of Persumei Nisa. So therefore, the Rambam. So part of we know there's a concept of darshinan time in the Kra that uncertain. There's a machokas Rabbi Huda Rav Shimon about when you do a mitzvah, so you have to does the reason play a role, limit the scope of the mitzvah. So the Torah says you can't take collateral from a widow. Okay. Doesn't say why. There's a machlokas. What about a rich widow? She had a nice life insurance policy. She was independently wealthy. Could you take collateral from a widow, a rich widow? Rabbi Yehuda says no. You can't. Ain't no darshin in time of the crop. The Torah says you can't take collateral, and the discussion. And the Shur says, what do you mean? God gave us a brain. We can figure it out. The only reason you can't do it is because she's poor. But if you have a rich widow, why not? So we generally assume, like Rabbi Yehuda, ain't no darshin in time in the crop, unless the Torah itself gives the reason for it. So by sukkahs, we don't pass it this way, but the Bach writes that you have to have in mind when you sit in the sukkah, it's not enough the mitzvah strichas kavana, l'man yedu dorasechem. You have to know why. You look at the schach and remember the miracles. That's what the Torah writes. The Torah also, who's a halacha sefer, he gives us a little history lesson like the Rabbi. He goes into the history of sukkahs, how they are covered. Because why? Because the Torah holds to fulfill the mitzvah of sukkah, you have to know exactly the reason behind it. So that's how they explain. The Rabbi went into the history of Chanuka because we've been pursuing these. So what happened on Chanuka? I got to know some details. So the Rabbi, in order to fulfill the mitzvah near Chanuka, he has to tell you what you have in mind. What you have to remember: the miracle of the oil, the miracle of the Greeks, and hence the Rabbi had to go into the history in order to teach us these halachas. So to summarize, we wanted to know if the Mishnah Torah is a halachic sefer, so how come he's telling us the history? So the simple pshat is because, according to the Rabbi, all you have is the 24 books of Tanakh in his book. So if I didn't tell you, you wouldn't know about Chanuka. Therefore, he has to tell you what Chanuka is. But still more than that, we need some halachic reasons. So we gave 4 different approaches. The first approach is to teach us the halacha. Why don't we say halal on Purim? Because Akate Avdei Achashverosh Anan. So what about Akate Avdei Greek Saya? So that's what the Rabbi is telling me. The Chashmonaim took control for 200 years and we had Jewish control government. That's one reason. Answer number 2, he said, why don't we have a Suda on Chanuka? Because Purim was physical, Chanuka was spiritual. But the Rambam holds there is a Suda, and the Rambam goes into the physical battle to teach us you have to have a Chiyuv Suda. We say it's praiseworthy, you should have one, and you have Divrei Torah and Shiras of the struggles, you make it into a Sudas mitzvah. That's the second reason the Rambam to teach me a Chiyuv Suda. The third reason is Babayu Sheni. Don't think this is a biblical mitzvah. It's not Baal Tosef, it is a mitzvah D'Rabbanan, and it's okay to celebrate Chanukah. That's why first Purim, then Chanukah. Without Purim, there wouldn't have been a Chanukah. And fourthly, the importance of pursuing Nisa to the miracle of Chanukah. To fulfill your mitzvah of near Chanukah, you got to know what's going on. So the Rabbi had to tell you about the miracles of the oil and the Mechama, and therefore one could fulfill the mitzvah of Chanukah properly with the pursuing Nisa. That's the whole concept of lighting and shul and all that. That since we moved it inside, we want to be able to publicize. We don't go as far as of Yaakov Emden, but the bracha makes it recognizable that we're doing it l'shem Chanukah, and therefore we can fulfill a mitzvah of pursuing Nisan Chanukah.